All right, I would like to welcome everyone. It's my privilege to welcome you to this webinar titled War in Ukraine, Past, Present, and Future, sponsored by the University of North Dakota. My name is David Flynn. I'm Research Director in the Institute of Policy and Business Analytics and a professor in the Nistler College of Business and Public Administration. I'm also your moderator. Since February 24, the world's attention turned towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war. We have 5 panelists with us today who will help us with context, information, and insights about this situation. They are Professor Paul Sum from the Political Science and Public Administration Department. He joined the University of North Dakota faculty ranks in 2000. His scholarly efforts address the interplay between political, culture, and behavior and in Central and Eastern Europe. Professor Sum served as an evaluator and consultant for the Council of Europe, OSCE, USAID, and the World Bank for various programs in the region. He maintains a special relationship with Romania, holding lecturer, fellow, and advisory board positions. In 2009 and 2010, he was also the recipient of a Fulbright Scholar Award to Romania, where he taught courses on research design and conducted research on the effectiveness of U.S. democracy assistance to the region. We also have Professor Brian Urlacher from the Political Science and Public Administration Department, who came to the university in 2007. He teaches courses in international relations, and his research focuses on cooperation under difficult circumstances. He's published on topics such as conflict resolution in civil wars and negotiation analysis. We also have Dr. S. Christina Wancha. She is an associate professor of epidemiology and biostatistics in the Department of Population Health at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Dr. Wancha lived for the first 18 years of her life under the despotic communist regime of the late Romanian president Nicolae Ceausescu. She lived through extreme shortages of food, medicine, electricity, and basic necessities under very harsh rules prohibiting freedom of speech and international travel to any non-communist country. Next, we have Dr. Alejandro Drago. He's a professor in the music school and is hailed by music critics as a superb musician. His discography includes string quartets, concertos, and avant-garde tangos for EMI International and Naxos Music Library, Japan. His successes are truly global, with awards and prizes from competitions in Italy, Yugoslavia, and Argentina, performances of his symphonic and chamber arrangements in Europe, Latin America, and the United States. And he's been a member of the jury for international competitions in Russia, China, and the United States. And then we have Professor Vasil Tkach, a Chester Fritz Distinguished Professor of Biology. He was born in the city of Rivne in northwestern Ukraine, the region with nature reminiscent of Minnesota and Wisconsin. He lived the first 28 years of his life in the Soviet Union and then 11 years in Ukraine after it gained independence. His background and extensive traveling and work in multiple Eastern European countries provides him a good grasp of the history in the country and the broader region. Vasil also knows Russia well because his father and much of his extended family are Russians. He speaks and reads 4 different languages and so is able to obtain information from a variety of sources and maintains close ties with his colleagues and friends in Ukraine and communicates with people within the country on a daily basis. I'll now turn it over to him, where he'll make some introductory remarks about the history of Ukraine, as well as providing some broader context to the current situation.
Thank you, David. I think, do you see my screen? Excuse me. Does everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So before we continue with our discussion and panel, I would like to introduce the country itself. Ukraine is the country positioned in the middle of Europe geographically or Eastern Europe politically. Before I proceed, I would like to say that whatever will be said, harsh words about invaders and those who send them, should not be extrapolated to many Russian people who oppose the war and actively protest this war. And with that, let's put to rest one of the biggest lies of Kremlin, that Ukraine is somehow threatening Russia. It cannot threaten Russia because, as you can see, the difference in size is greater than between David and Goliath, really. Just a very brief crash course of history. So Kiev was founded in the year 482. According to the legend, it was founded by 3 Viking brothers and their sister. The name of one of these brothers was Key, and hence the city was named Kiev. And that said, the more commonly used in English pronunciation Kiev is Russian, so I will use the word Kiev in the pronunciation. Just for the reference, Moscow was founded more than 600 years later, which puts to rest another myth of Russian propaganda that Ukraine somehow always belonged to Russia. Centuries later, one of the Kiev kings, well, queen in this case, adopted Christianity. The Queen Olga did a lot to try to introduce Christianity to that part of the world. The task was completed in 1988 by the King Volodymyr the Great. Both Olga and Volodymyr are both Catholic and Orthodox saints, which is a rare case. And you can see the images in the St. Peter Basilica in Rome. Kiev has always been called the Golden Domed City. That's because of the countless churches that had this characteristic onion-shaped, often golden domes. So the Sophia Monastery was established in 11th century. Some of the major churches have been destroyed by Soviets, like this one, but this one was rebuilt. The landmark of Kiev, the Laura Monastery, is really beautiful any time of the year, but particularly in summer. Again, fast forward centuries, independent Ukraine existed as a Cossack state. So the Cossack warriors had elected power. The leader was called Hetman, and Zaporizhian Sich existed as an independent state within the Cossack Hetmanate for over 100 years, between 16th and 18th century, until it was disbanded under Russian Empress Catherine II in 1775. That meant loss of all freedoms in Ukraine. Well, something happened that is very remarkable during the Zaporizhia Sich statehood. In 1710, they have developed the first democratic modern constitution that established the principle of separation of powers in government between the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches. That happened well before the United States Constitution. Again, fast forward, after World War I, an independent Ukraine made another attempt on independence, and Ukrainian People's Republic was established and existed for under 3 years when it lost its independence again to Bolshevik Russia, and that state was much larger than today's Ukraine, including large parts which are now Russia. During those times before the World War II, there was another horrendous crime committed by the Soviet regime to Ukrainian people, known as Holodomor, or terror famine. It was a peacetime, man-made famine that killed, according to United Nations document, about 7 to 10 million Ukrainians. Many countries have recognized it officially as a genocide of Ukrainian people. And this is a National Museum and a monument to Holodomor. Well, Then World War II came, of course, and Ukraine was a stage and place of some of the fiercest battles for several years. And this is a picture taken after the attack of Kiev by Nazis. This is a picture taken a few days ago after attack by Russians. If you cannot see the difference other than color of these images, you are not alone. There aren't any. Soviet Union has collapsed in 1991 and Ukraine regained its independence again. And it's a statue at the Independence Square that said the high bush cranberry is an emblematic national plant in Ukraine. So shown here. The Independence Square in the center of Kiev did not always look so calm. It was a central place for the peaceful process during the Orange Revolution in 2004, and then during the protests against pro-Russian president in 2013 that was followed by the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, which brings us to the current events. This is a map of Russian military invasion as of yesterday. As you can see, the country was attacked from all directions. Russia invaded with about 200,000 strong army, an overwhelming number of tanks, aircrafts, missiles, warships, all sorts of equipment. They planned the victory parade in Kyiv within 2-3 days. Well, as you know, this didn't happen. Ukrainian army and just barely formed territorial defense bravely and extremely effectively, surprisingly even to me, fight this uneven battle. They thank countries who provided anti-tank and anti-helicopter weapon systems, including the United States, Britain, and other countries, but they need more. Sustaining major losses at the battlefield and unable to achieve a significant military victory, Russians in desperation turned on soft civilian targets. The countless war crimes and atrocities committed by Russian invaders are despicable. The amount of destruction and loss of life is mounted by the hour as we speak. Invaders not only indiscriminately hit civilian targets, they methodically and purposefully destroying civilian infrastructure, creating humanitarian crisis and causing directly and indirectly very large number of civilian casualties. At least 63 hospitals were destroyed. Yesterday, they bombed the maternity clinic in Mariupol. There are many cases of shooting at unarmed civilians, ambulances, schools. More than 2 million people fled abroad, and many are internally displaced. Almost all refugees are women and children because males between 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave the country. In fact, dozens of thousands of men returned to Ukraine to fight. My younger colleague in Kyiv stood for 2.5 hours in a long line just to sign up for the territorial defense and get his Kalashnikov, his PhD and professor. There's even a new kind of corruption. People are trying to give bribe to get ahead of others in the line, to be able to fight and possibly die. That said, another myth that needs to be put to rest. A very high proportion of soldiers on the front line and volunteers in those lines of waiting to join the battle are Russian-speaking. These last 2 weeks, Russia attacked and destroyed cities populated predominantly by Russian-speaking people. The language you speak has no connection to how you feel about your country. I'm mostly a Russian-speaking person. Americans have illustrated this perfectly during their war for independence. Well, Ukrainians will never forget these crimes. The families who lost their loved ones, who lost their life that's now destroyed, will not forget. Babies born in the bomb shelters will not forget. Although my heart is breaking now, I'm proud of my people and I believe they will prevail. Well, there are many questions about the immediate future, and that will be a subject of today's discussion. One of the big questions is who will be next. I just wanted to mention one aspect. While everyone is talking about oil and gas prices, the real-time bomb set by Putin is what will happen later this year and next winter. If farmers will not be able to plant their fields in time, and it's almost time in some parts of the country, it will mean food shortage for millions. Moreover, since Ukraine is the world's fifth largest exporter of grain, there will be starvation in countries that are far from Ukraine. It probably also means higher prices for the grain produced by North Dakota farmers, but I will leave this topic to my colleagues. With this, I will finish this brief presentation.
Thank you very much. I should tell the audience, please feel free to forward questions using the Q&A feature you see at the bottom of the screen. We will be collecting questions and asking them at the end of the presentations. At this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Wansha. She will be talking, amongst other things, about the freedom of speech experience she's had and consequences of obstruction and some other matters.
Thank you very much. So, as you have heard about the history of Ukraine, I want to talk a little bit about the location of Ukraine within the entire European map and also within the context of NATO. We all know by now NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization that has currently 30 members, including United States and Canada. And Ukraine has expressed its intent to join not only the European Union, but also NATO, causing Russia to get quite upset about their decision. And being one of the reasons that Russia decided to invade Ukraine. In fact, Russia has also warned Sweden and Finland. As you can see here, Sweden and Finland are grayed out, meaning they are not NATO members, that if they have such similar intentions, potentially they will be next. The country of Romania borders Ukraine at the north of the country and also towards the tail of the country. And then the country of Moldavia, which is a former territory of Romania, is also not a NATO member. So talking about who is next, there are many worries about the potential of Moldavia being next, and then the eventuality of Romania being next, although that will be a huge catastrophe because Romania being part of NATO, that will really trigger an even bigger war. I can only say that I'm very proud of the Romanian people being so welcoming of the suffering women and children who are trying to flee from Ukraine. One of the countries that are trying to flee to is Romania, and the other country is Poland. Majority of Ukrainians are trying to flee. In Poland, more than 1 million Ukrainians have tried to flee and have fled to Poland. Once again, majority being women and children, since men ages 18 to 60 will stay back home to fight for their country. As of today, and this is a snapshot of one of our Romanian TV station named DG24, there were recorded 343,515 total Ukrainian refugees in Ukraine, majority of which are trying to leave also Romania because they are afraid that Romania will be next. So out of them, there are a total of 84,671 still left in the country, and out of those, already 3,520 have asked for an asylum. That being said, I totally concur that we should not confuse the government with the people. And talking about Russia invading Ukraine, I want to remind everybody that not too long ago, the whole area, the whole region was a communist area. As such, we were under huge restrictions, speech limitations. I remember we were having only 2 hours of TV a day, and those were about the Communist Party. And so our only connection to the outside was via shortwave radio, via Radio Free Europe, who was broadcasting from Germany at the time. And the police, the Romanian police, had technology to spy from the street and to listen in through some special devices to see what people were talking in the houses. So there was a major fear because a lot of people were caught listening to Radio Free Europe, and they would come and pick people up from their houses in the middle of the night, never telling the family, never telling anybody where those people were taken. Over 800,000 political prisoners, due to lack of freedom of speech, were actually murdered in Romania between the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s through 1989, when we had the Romanian Revolution and Romania finally got rid of communism. The overall estimates, including Romanians located in former Romanian territories, are close to 2,500,000 Romanians being killed during this communist regime. So a similar situation happened to other communist countries, including Russia. Some estimates are in the over 10 million of people being killed in Russia for similar reasons during the communist regime. So that's why I want to emphasize the fact that Russia and Russian leaders are not the same as Russian people. The freedom of speech in Russia was a little bit better in the last 20 years, but then in the last 10 years, restrictions started to occur more and more until more recent, when the Russian government just passed a law making the intentional speaking of fake or false, whatever they call it, fake and false news about the war in Ukraine, a criminal offense punishable by jail for terms up to 15 years. So far, they had a lot of demonstration in Russia, and more than 7,500 anti-war demonstrators were arrested, and at least 4,366 people were detained in jails across 53 cities in Russia. The media, the official media in Russia, is actually controlled by the government, and there are strict limitations right now also to the internet connection and the internet websites, a lot of them being shut down. We already know about Facebook, we already know about Telegram, and many more. And that's all I wanted to share at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Drago, who will talk a little bit about nationality versus citizenship and some of his other experiences.
My experience is, or more exactly, what I want to talk is about perception, about feelings and identities, which is another side of the coin that, well, may seem not that relevant as the hard facts that are being presented or will be presented by my colleagues. However, I will argue that these perceptions are such an ingrained aspect of the reality that they shape actions, they shape politics, and it is fundamental to understand them. So I would like to rather share first-person insights and then some reflections on a number of things that, as a 20-year-old student from South America, from a rather thriving, culturally speaking, South American country, at least for the region, a well-integrated, socially well-integrated country, had arriving in Russia. So in no particular order, as I learned the language, which I managed to master to a close to a native level after so many years of living and studying there, I was surprised to find out a very interesting expression. In Russian, it's called пятая графа, or пятый пункт, which means the fifth graphic or the fifth point that refers not exactly to your national document, but to your work documents that listed your first name, middle name, last name, date of birth, and nationality. It took me a while to understand that the concept of nationality within this paradigm was totally detached from the concept of citizenship. Whereas in my country of origin, Argentina, if you looked Black or Asian or whatever, we would say that you are an Argentinian of Asian origin, an Argentinian of Black roots. That is, it's even the construction in Spanish. We don't have the concept or even the word to name that concept, that you are Argentinian only by virtue of your certificate of birth and certain civic rights, but actually you represent a different nation, even though you were born here and you speak exactly the same language as we do, whereas at home you can speak another language. It took me a while just to grasp this simple concept. I remember talking to a colleague of mine. I had discovered the recordings of a fantastic violinist, Boris Goldstein. So if you're a Russian speaker, you already know everything that follows this. Boris Goldstein, he cannot be considered Russian by any means because he's Jewish. And I said innocently, oh, I found this fantastic Russian violinist, Boris Goldstein. And the way they look at me was funny. I mean, in retrospective, it's not funny at all, but it was like, you're talking about, he was a Jew, right? I mean, he was one of the greatest violinists ever to come from the Soviet Union. However, he wasn't a friend of the regime. Therefore, he didn't make the big career that other people made, right? Another thing that I would like to mention before I get to the core of what I wanted to share with you is the challenge that for a translator poses the fact that the word Russian is expressed in two different words in Russian. One is two different adjectives, right? One is Ruski, and the other one is Российский. And there is no way of differentiating those two words in pretty much any other language other than, but by means of a periphrasis, right? Ruski refers to that which, in terms of nationality, is Russian, be that a person or the language. Whereas Российский or Российская refers to that which pertains to the Russian state, but not necessarily to Russians as a culture or as an ethnicity. Which means that you can be a Russian citizen, российский гражданин, but nobody will at all consider you Russian. In fact, you may not consider yourself Russian, whereas you may be a citizen of Moldova or Ukraine or Latvia and seriously consider yourself Russian. And this all stems in well, I mean, this all begins in the 19th century with the concept of nation state and the attempts at enforcing new borders based on that. This is a long story. The problem is that within this diversity of identities, and there is a Kazakhstani historic, I cannot recall his name exactly now, but he made a compelling argument that the Soviet Union wasn't but the supremacist ideal of the Russian Empire in terms of culture continued under a different ideological banner. So the echoes of this we see even today, because the argument that the Putin regime uses to sell this war that they even are allowed to call a war to its own population is that they are acting in the rescue of Ruskich, of the Russian population of Ukraine. But as Dr. Tkach pointed out, this argument crumbles on its own base under any objective scrutiny, but that's another thing that is not happening. So I know that my time is coming to an end, but I wanted to point out, or at least start the conversation about the problem of national identities. They conflict with the actual citizenship and place of living of these peoples and the historical precedent of Russian cultural supremacism from the Tsarist empire to the Soviet Union to the new nationalism embodied by Putin's political movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. We'll turn now to Professor Sum. Amongst other things, we'll talk about the current and burgeoning humanitarian crisis that we see in Ukraine. So please, Professor Sum.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate here. I'm going to limit my remarks to 5 primary points. Some of them will echo what my colleagues have already covered, and I think it'll just underline how important some of those points are. The first is that I've had a lot of experience working with and evaluating the effects of democracy assistance that was part of U.S. foreign policy in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I want to impress upon you that this destabilizing action by Russia is not a unique event. This has been going on since the demise of the Soviet Union. And so when Ukraine declared independence and indicated that it was going to move towards a democratic regime, Russia, in a variety of ways, supporting anti-democratic forces within the country, primarily, sometimes during elections, sometimes outside of elections, posed a regular menace to that project. And so this attack is, in my view, a continuation of Russian policy towards an independent Ukraine. And when we put it in that perspective, I think you can appreciate how the escalation is transforming. The second point is the destabilization efforts have created a monumental humanitarian crisis. And so my colleagues mentioned that you have over 2 million Ukrainian refugees. Those are outside the country. 1.4 actually in Poland as of today. But that doesn't count the millions of people who have been displaced internally. When I've talked to colleagues over the last week, they discuss and they tell me about Ukrainian refugees. The pictures we see are horrific. But keep in mind that many of these refugees are people that have the means or had the means to collect resources and get out of the country. Many of the internally displaced people are those that are the most vulnerable in Ukrainian society. They're the ones who cannot get out. Now, part of that is by design from Russian forces, but some of it is simply that they don't have the means. And so the humanitarian crisis is particularly devastating for Ukrainians trying to survive as internally displaced people. That would be without refuge, without shelter, without reliable sources of food, without the ability to communicate with those that they love. And so that kind of humanitarian crisis it's hard to get our head around it. There's the basic need that we see in that crisis, the immediate needs, and the UN is working as they can to satisfy some of those needs. Simply put, we've had millions upon millions of lives that are shattered, but that's the immediate need. We are also on the cusp of looking at the short-term needs that are going to arise. Right? Currently, you can't describe a healthcare system that operates in Ukraine, not in any real sense. Maybe in Lviv in some of the western parts, you have clinics that are operating, but not in a way that would satisfy basic human needs. This is triage at best. In Poland, in Romania, in Hungary, in other bordering countries, the refugees, as they continue to come, are placing healthcare needs, other kinds of burdens on those countries. Romania, as was mentioned, has already processed nearly 350,000 refugees, and 85,000 or so remain in Romania. The Romanian state has committed to supplying resources for 70,000 refugees. That has already been exceeded. They have allotted resources for 30 days, but what happens then? And so the humanitarian crisis is unfolding like a snowball. And as we move in from the immediate need to the short-term needs, we're going to see this as a growing crisis, not something that just goes away, regardless of what's happening on the battlefield. The third or the fourth point, or the third point I want to make is that on top of all of this, there's a broader international context. There is what we might refer to as the humanitarian regime. That is the infrastructure, the international infrastructure of organizations and financial energies that try to address these kinds of problems. Very unfortunately, Ukraine is only the latest in a number of refugee humanitarian crises. And so it adds to the list of crises that we see coming out of Yemen, coming out of Syria, coming out of Ethiopia, coming out of different parts of Central Africa, just to name a few. And so when we think about this crisis, it's not only limited to Ukraine, but it adds to the burden internationally that we are facing. The last point is more towards this future, and thinking about what happens with resolution. There is avenues for justice, and war crimes are being documented, and I'm optimistic, cautiously, that at least some level of justice might be found through either the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. Right? This is not an action that will be forgotten, and the international community is in a better position now to address these things than it has been in the past. And so the international machinery is starting to work, and let's see where it goes. I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sum. We will turn to our last speaker now, Professor Urlacher. Please, Professor Urlacher, take it away, talking about navigating the post-Cold War timeframe and conflict and those kinds of diplomacy issues. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Hopefully technology is working. I had my computer lose internet and then go into a forcible restart, which was quite an interesting development. So I'm operating without my notes, but I think I can get my point across, which is that for most, well, I should say for the United States, we have not had to think seriously about the possibility of a conflict between two nuclear armed states that could escalate into a nuclear exchange for about 30 plus years. And for most Americans, median age 40-ish, that's never been something that they've had to consider. And so this is, I think, something that a lot of people are processing through in real time, the risks and the consequences of where we are at and what makes this conflict different from things we've seen in the past. But during the Cold War, this was something that the United States and the Soviet Union worried about, fretted about, thought about a lot, and worked actively and consciously to try to avoid taking steps that would trigger an escalation that would end in a nuclear exchange. And so everything from installing communication for deconfliction so that the President of the United States can reach the Soviet premier and say, it looks like we are on a collision course. It looks like we have the possibility of striking your people. How do we avoid that? How do we separate? How do we get them out so that this is not an accident that spirals into something else? There was sort of a playbook of things that you could do that would be treated as acceptable rather than an escalation. And so I think the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 is a useful sort of illustration of this, where when Soviet forces moved into Afghanistan, the Carter administration responded with diplomatic criticism. It responded by decoupling some forms of cooperation. So there had been an arms limitation treaty that was in the Senate, and that was paused. The US boycotts the 1980 Olympics. Again, sort of political responses that are viewed as acceptable, that are unlikely to escalate. The Carter administration increased military spending. That was considered a reasonable response. The Carter administration imposed sanctions, stopped purchases or selling grain to the Soviet Union. The Carter administration began providing non-lethal aid to Mujahideen fighters who were resisting Soviet occupation. A few years later, the Reagan administration began providing lethal aid, guns, but did so with the idea that there should be deniability in the US policy response. And so instead of just simply shipping in guns, they were routed, it was, I think, a Chinese factory in Egypt that was manufacturing a Chinese design of AK-47s, which were then routed into Pakistan and distributed through the Pakistan intelligence service. Again, for the idea of deniability, that the United States was taking steps that were resulting in Soviet soldiers being killed. And it wasn't until the mid-1980s that the Reagan administration decided to take an even more provocative, aggressive step of providing shoulder-fired missiles that could attack Soviet helicopters and planes. Some of the Stinger missiles, sometimes described as man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, I believe is the acronym. But that's something that would be very obviously coming from the United States. And so we saw this sort of escalation of, here are things that the United States can do to respond and to push back and to complicate this invasion that in Afghanistan played out over the course of 6-7 years. We've seen that escalation process play out in 6 days in Ukraine to get a sense of just how rapidly the global response has been, but it's still operating within sort of that structure of avoiding direct escalation, direct conflict that could possibly spiral into something else. Now, I want to flag 4 things that make this conflict a little bit different that maybe didn't exist as much in the Cold War, and therefore we don't really have a sense of how to navigate. One of those is the domain of space. There are Russian and American astronauts sharing the International Space Station right now. But also the vulnerability of satellites to attack. That's a domain that we didn't have to think about potentially during the Cold War, the way that it is a potential zone of escalation today. Second is cyber. I think there's a whole host of ways in which cyber warfare or even just information warfare through the internet plays in this conflict. And I'm happy to talk a little bit and speculate about that, but it will be long-winded. A third way that I think we're seeing technology change the way things operate is with autonomous systems. That if a Predator drone fires on a Russian tank, we don't know if the pilot for that Predator drone is in Grand Forks or Poland or Kyiv. And there's no way to identify it, and that creates, again, another layer of uncertainty about who is doing what. And then the final thing that is maybe different and we don't really have a playbook for is civilian nuclear reactors. As far as I can tell, there has never been a war between 2 countries that have civilian nuclear reactors where the reactors have been attacked and seized as part of an invasion force. And again, we don't necessarily have a playbook for how to navigate that or what that could possibly mean in terms of conflict. And so I think there's some things about this particular conflict that are unprecedented, and yet we're still working with a playbook that is fairly well established in terms of how you support a country in need against aggression while avoiding that escalation that could be cataclysmic for everyone. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Erlacher. All right, I'm going to start asking the questions from the audience, as well as some questions that were emailed to us ahead of time. I'm going to start with one that I think probably, and I'm going to tell all panelists to feel free to weigh in. But there's a very important question that asks, does anyone wish to comment on where they find the most accurate news in English, in a parenthetical there, on the situation? And I think that would be an important one to hear from our panelists. Where are they finding accurate news? So please.
I cannot say, because I'm reading exclusively sources in Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian. Besides being in direct contact with people on both sides of the border, and I mean literally, like Belgorod, Kharkov, you know, it's what, 60 miles maybe. A lot of people through social media whom I know, they give me direct information. But what I've seen in our major outlets, regardless of their left-leaning or right-leaning tendencies, seems, the big picture of it seems accurate. Of course, both CNN and Fox are putting their own spinning on this. CNN is insisting that this is all Trump's fault, of course, and Fox is insisting that the negligence of the Democrats is the cause of all this. Now, if you can filter that out and stick to the facts, I would say that what they are presenting matches the picture that I'm getting from the original language and in situ sources.
I would concur. A lot of the news that I get are in either Romanian language, or I listen to the German news, the Deutsche Welle, or in France. But there are two news stations that I would highly recommend in English. That's BBC World, and the other one would be France 24 in English language.
I would add the DW in Germany also is published in English. And the United Nations itself, depending on what you're interested in, has a series of press releases on a regular basis. And I find that to be fairly accurate, at least in terms of some of the factual information of what's going on, what we know is going on inside.
I'll answer in a slightly different way. And that is that there is a temptation to want the up-to-the-minute sort of freshest of fresh takes of what's happening on the ground. And I think that if you go that route, you're always going to be in danger of getting information pushed to you through social media that is not necessarily reflective, because you are in an active information war zone. If you are going through Twitter or Facebook or any social media, and there's information that's being pushed out to paint a particular picture, if you're concerned about accurate information, I would say step back and wait for the Washington Post, the New York Times, or BBC World to push out a story. It might not be the thing that happened, an hour ago, but you will walk away, I think, with a more judicious and informed set of information that you can be a little bit more confident.
I would like to make an important distinction, one that in the last 6 years seems to be rather lost in American journalism, at least. There is reporting and there are opinion articles. And traditionally, they used to be clearly, even typographically separated in serious outlets. They have interbred, apparently, and so hardly can you read any report without editorializing or any editorial passing as report. So there is that additional filtering to be done.
Excellent point. Thank you. We have multiple questions submitted about aid and support towards the people of Ukraine, but not just in terms of financial support. There have been questions of what other kinds of actions could be undertaken to transmit support to the people of Ukraine. So I throw that out there broadly. Financial, I received a question asking if small donations needed to be massed into larger donations. but then also what non-financial things could we be doing to support? And so I'd like to have the panel address that.
Yeah, if I could jump in on the financial part, what I was describing, I made reference to the humanitarian infrastructure internationally. And part of what I'm referring to is organizations like the International Red Cross, UNICEF, other UN agencies. They all are accepting donations, and they are in a better position to filter that money to local organizations that are doing the work. So there's a lot of nonprofits, NGOs that are working in Poland and Romania, etc. A group I support is in Romania, Social Initiative group, which is they've been assisting refugees in Romania for a decade already. But without having that knowledge, I also know that Ukrainian American, I have it written down, sorry. The US Ukrainian Foundation is taking money and giving it to local NGOs. So I would stay with large, well-known actors to donate money if that's your disposition, simply because they have a better handle of where to direct the money. Other things to do, very simply, is to talk about it, to educate yourself, to remind yourself that this is real, what the implications are, and sort of inserting it into your own life. But I think my colleagues might have other things to add.
Perhaps not. Okay, then we can turn to another question. Multiple questions have been asked about the way this will progress, but I'm going to highlight this one now. Do you believe the sanctions are enough currently to prevent any further invasions or expansions of this action?
I guess I'll jump in, and that might be in my wheelhouse. So sanctions have a mixed record of being effective. I would suggest that the role of sanctions isn't to necessarily change behavior, because by the time you see a sanction applied, it's already failed. That sanctions are used as, if you take this step, there will be a response, and it will probably sting. And aggressive actors, like Russia in this case, have made the calculation that they can withstand those sanctions. And so it's only after they've made that calculation that you actually see sanctions in place. Now, countries can misjudge what might happen. And I think the scale and the speed and the scope and the unity of the sanctions certainly took me by surprise, and it may have taken many others by surprise. But I would suggest that maybe the next step isn't necessarily constrained by the sanctions. It's constrained by the war in Ukraine has not gone as well as Putin expected. I think his military is performing far worse. And so currently just salvaging that situation is priority number one. And steps beyond Ukraine bump up against NATO. And there's not a lot of space for additional steps that doesn't produce the kind of cataclysmic outcome that I think everybody has an incentive, including Vladimir Putin and the whole of the Russian leadership, to avoid. So I'm not concerned in the immediate short term about the next step escalation. Just my view.
Other comments? Okay, well, then for any or all panelists thinking about Paul's cautious optimism regarding justice for those responsible for the invasion and war crimes, what do you see as the best possible likely outcome for the people of Ukraine, and yet realistic given the nature of Russian forces?
Well, that's difficult to assess because, to put it bluntly, Is it better to be alive and a slave or die a free man? Just to put it bluntly. But when push comes to shove, you know, thousands of people at this very moment, my friends with whom I'm in touch, are making this decision. So you want me to say, oh, I hope this all stops and Russia keeps half of the territory of Ukraine and puts some marionette, president there. You know, knowing how I know Ukrainians, how close I am to them and their traditions and way of thinking, I don't think that this is exactly a good outcome, although that would stop the war, certainly. And Putin would be just ecstatic to stop the war. It's costing him like crazy money. Then we can all go about our business and pretending this never happened, you know, which is likely what's going to happen. That's the nature of the markets, right? They are impersonal in that regard. Now, do I want any war, whatever, to go on? Of course not. But there is not a good outcome, because any good outcome will come at the price, either human, political, long-term, short-term, economic. So I don't know what to say, but just to assume that the people of Ukraine, let me give you an example. Into the second, third day of war, there were already talks in Belarus, right? And some people ask me, well, apparently, you know, cooler heads are prevailing, you know, they started the talks. And I had two things to say, you know. First, this is pour la galerie, like they say in French, you know, just to show that this is happening. And the fact that they having like the 5th round of talks and nothing absolutely happened. And the only things that they decided upon, namely the humanitarian corridor, is not being observed, that tells you a lot. But more importantly, after the 8 years of the revamping of the Ukrainian army and the, you know, all the processes that happen in Ukraine and the resurgence of a new sense of Ukrainian nationality that goes beyond the language boundaries, I don't think that Zelensky or anybody can decide anything that the Ukrainians would not approve, because if the Ukrainians do not approve of it, it's dead on arrival. All those people who are armed now will not take anything from their president or premier minister or anything that they cannot second and support. There will be armed resistance to any agreement that does not match the will of the Ukrainian people. That I can bet anything to it. So I don't know what the good outcome is here. The good outcome is perhaps, you know, Russia, you know, Putin, you know, being conveniently removed by the people in his entourage whose interests he's affecting. Perhaps that's the best outcome.
Christina, did you have something?
Yes, Putin is extremely unpredictable. And I don't think that even people in his close entourage really know all the time what he wants to do next. The truth being told, we are not too far removed from the horrible times of the communism regime and of the Russian influence over the Eastern European countries, and the impact of those influences in terms of economical aspects, freedom of speech aspects, freedom of travel, you name it. It was one of the darkest period of time. Romanians, for example, right now wish for the best and prepare for the worst. The lines at the passport offices are humongous. People are getting ready to have a passport to flee, especially women, children. Men also in Romania are ready to fight because they know otherwise what the outcome will be. So I'm hoping for the best. I'm hoping this war will start with a very good outcome for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people, as good as it can be at this point after so many lives have already been lost, and this should have never happened, especially in the 21st century. But I don't know, I've seen too much to say I'm really 90% sure that this will stop.
I guess I would just jump in since it was my cautious optimism that was referenced. The optimism comes more in a much longer shadow to the future. When we talk about prosecuting war crimes, it's nice to think that it's like a domestic system, that all you have to do is catch the perpetrator and the wheels of justice begin. That's not the way it works in the international community. However, I would point to the former president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, who was indicted for crimes against humanity, acts of genocide, and war crimes. He is currently not, he has not been arrested, but he also has very limited travel. It was his undoing domestically that led to this that tragedy, and he was displaced. You know, we don't know what's going to happen, and so I'm not a military expert. I don't know what on the ground it's going to look like. But what I do know is that those types of crimes don't have statutes of limitations, and to think that Vladimir Putin is all supreme and will be there for the next until his demise is, I think, giving him too much credit. So, as was stated earlier, forces, opposition forces do exist in Russia. Yes, they are being rounded up, but yet they are still there. And we've been impressing upon, hopefully, everybody that Russian people are not generally in favor of this. They don't know what's happening, or if they know what's happening, they're abhorred. And so that suggests to me that Russia is not as stable, is not omnipotent as the rhetoric would have us believe. And because of that, again, I don't know what the immediate settlement will be, but we will see the opportunity for these crimes to be heard.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to unfortunately stop it there. We reached the end of our hour. We have always more and continuing questions than we can get to in the time we have. But I'd like to thank all the panelists for taking their time and sharing their insights on this situation. I'm sure it will be something that we might have to call them back for in the future. But if you continue to have questions, I would encourage you to go ahead, and my email was on the announcement, and I can direct questions to those who might have the best information to answer it. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for our presenters, and thank you very much for all your times.